Welcome back, everyone. It's been a good long while since I reviewed anything by Anne Rice on the channel, but I'm finally getting back into her work. But now, instead of the Vampire Chronicles, I'm finally digging into the Mayfair Witches Trilogy. And I've got to say, the first book in the series, which is the one that I'm going to be reviewing today, might just be one of the best Anne Rice books that I've read so far. So let's get into the summary, and then let's talk about why. Part 1. Summary. Rowan Mayfair is a respected neurosurgeon in California, whose life changes when she discovers that her estranged birth mother has died in New Orleans. After learning this, she begins to learn about the mysterious and wealthy Mayfair family to which she belongs, and stands to inherit the family home as well as a mysterious legacy. Michael Curry is a contractor, specialising in the restoration of old houses. Aside from recalling childhood memories of seeing a strange man that other people seem not to see as a boy, nothing remarkable happens in Michael's life until he almost drowns, only to be saved by Rowan. While drowning, Michael has a near-death experience, and when he returns to life, gains the ability of clairvoyance, which initially sends him a little mad, until Rowan, who also has powers of her own, helps him. The two fall in love, and when Michael decides to return to New Orleans, his hometown, she follows him to learn about her family history. Aaron Leitner is a psychic scholar of the Talamasca, a secret organisation that studies magic and the occult, and has studied the Mayfair family for centuries. A key supernatural event in the history is the appearance of a spirit named Lasher, who seems to have brought the Mayfair family both great fortune and great tragedy. Aaron contacts Michael and shares with him the history of the Mayfair witches, right from the beginning to the present day. But when we return to the present day, Rowan and Michael are left to deal with Lasher, who has now set his designs upon them, and who seems desperate to tear them apart. Part 2. The history of the Mayfair witches. So one thing that Anne Rice does in the Vampire Chronicles, and also in this particular story with the Mayfair witches, is tell stories embedded in other stories. In the Vampire Chronicles, this is very explicit. Every single book is meant to basically be an actual book that the vampire has written himself or herself, or it is some kind of interview in the case of the first book. Now, The Witching Hour doesn't have that general format, but a big portion of the book, the whole second part of the book, is dedicated to the retelling of the Mayfair history through documents and papers and reports and letters the various characters have written themselves. So at least this part does kind of hark back to the Vampire Chronicles and that sort of reporting chronicle style. The chronicling of the various generations of the Mayfair witches takes us all the way from 1700s in Scotland all the way up to the 1920s in New Orleans. Now, when I was reading the book and it got to this part and I could tell that Rice was going to go on a huge digression to tell this history, I have to say I was a bit worried about whether I would like the story or not. Rice does this in a lot of her works. She will have a story and set things up, and then the story will stop so that a character can tell us a story within that story. I'm thinking here of Memnoch the Devil, for example, where the story is meant to build a start, but then once we get to Memnoch, he just basically dominates the narrative while he tells his story till the start. And in that book, it did jar in terms of the pacing of the book, and for many people it's one of the reasons why they don't like that book in the Vampire Chronicles so much. So in this book, I was worried that this was going to really screw up the pacing, but actually it turned out to not do that, and this part that dealt with the history of the Mayfair witches was, for me at least, the most interesting and well-crafted part of the entire book. Rice not only managed throughout this history to keep the mystery surrounding Lasher fresh and interesting as we moved through the generations, but she also succeeded every time in taking you to a historical place. Whether that's New Orleans in the 20s, which, you know, she loves to write about New Orleans generally, but whether it's that place, whether it's Scotland in the 1700s and the Inquisition, whatever the time period we're in, Rice just seems to know so much about the time period. She seems to research quite a lot into her history, so that when she goes to each place throughout time and we see the different generations of Mayfairs, it really does feel distinctive. It feels like you're going through this journey, through these different time periods, and it was just really well done. There's also a nice difference between the Mayfair Witches and the Vampire Chronicles. In the Vampire Chronicles, you also have this moving through time, like in Interview with the Vampire, where, you know, you're following Louis from his birth as a vampire all the way up to the present day, and you're seeing the world change around Louis, but the tragedy of the vampire is he or she stays the same. So, you know, the character doesn't really evolve. Louis is always this big, brooding, miserable git. Whereas in the Mayfair Witches, not only are we moving through time, but obviously the witches aren't immortal, so they die like anyone else. And so what you get is not just the world changing around you, but also the characters that we're following. We're seeing those characters change as they grow up and get older, and then we're seeing what effects they have and what effects Lasher has on the future generations. So it was a nice way in which Rice still kept that canonical style from the vampire books, but did something to make it a bit fresher, because we've got these characters growing up and changing with the times, rather than having the times changing and the characters staying the same. Also, each generation was just so different. You know, they were all very much products of their time, and so you don't feel like you're getting bored or this is getting repetitive. In fact, I would say that pretty much every generation of Mayfair Witches had their own mystery, their own personalities, their own things that made them interesting, and their own dynamics with each other. And so, going through the history, I never really got bored. And in fact, if Rice had have just written a whole book, even just as long as this one, on that history, getting more into the details about it, that would have been all the more interesting to me. So I just thought that this was a really well thought out, well structured, well developed part of the book. Part 3. Expansive prose. So one of the mainstays of Anne Rice's writing style, and one of the most divisive parts of her writing style, is her kind of penchant for very dramatic, very verbose prose, very literary, very Gothic. And for some people, they love that style, and I'm one of those people, but other people it can be a little bit much sometimes. I think for people who struggle with Rice's more long-winded books, then The Witching Hour might be problematic with that because it is very long, but if you like that style, if you like the Gothic, elaborate prose that Rice does, I think, really well, then I think you'll definitely enjoy The Witching Hour. In the third part of the book, when Rowan and Michael are exploring the Mayfair house together, Rice really does spend a lot of time describing every nook and cranny of this house. And I think for some people that could come across as incredibly tedious. You know, why do you need to describe everything? We can imagine what a big house looks like. But I think what Rice is doing in this part is she's really trying to build the mystery and character of this house. In fact, I'd go as far as to say that for Rice in this book, the Mayfair house is meant to be a character itself. It's full of mysteries, it's full of history, and so Rice doesn't want you to just kind of picture this generic, haunted, creepy house in your head. She wants you to really get a feel for this house, a presence, as if it's a character rather than just a setting. And I think that makes sense then why she spends so much time describing it. Because if something's a character rather than just a setting, you really want to get across the uniqueness of the thing. Whereas if she didn't spend so much time describing the house, you know, you just imagine a generic creepy house in your head. You wouldn't be thinking of it as a big characterful thing with lots of mystery. So for me, looking at the bigger context of the book and what Rice is doing with the Mayfair house, I actually really enjoyed that part of the book because, you know, the house really does feel like a significant presence because of this work that she does to describe it and to show you how it's changed throughout the years. So Rice really does have an eye for detail, and as I was reading this book, I couldn't help but draw comparisons to Anne Radcliffe. For those of you who don't know, Anne Radcliffe is one of the most important writers in Gothic fiction and was actually credited with pioneering the whole genre of Gothic fiction. Both of these writers seem to have a real eye for detail, and they really want to convey an atmosphere and setting just as much as they want to convey character and plot. In Radcliffe's most famous work, The Mysteries of Udolpho, which I have reviewed on this channel, Radcliffe spends a lot of time describing the scenery that the characters are in. And that does damage the pacing a little bit, but at the same time, it really makes you feel like you're there in the story. And Rice has a very similar style to that. She really wants to create a mood, create an atmosphere, and create a setting. And if you have the patience for it, then I think it's a really rewarding thing and one of the better parts about her writing style. But like with Radcliffe, there is a drawback to this very verbose style of writing, which I'll get onto in the next part. Part 4. Pacing problems. So having read 6 of the Vampire Chronicles books, and now The Witching Hour, I can see that there is a consistent problem with Anne Rice's writing, and it's a thing that a lot of people talk about, and that is the pacing of her books. Now Rice loves to digress, she loves to tell stories within stories, and she loves to spend hundreds of pages describing scary houses. And while these things do have their, positives, I think they do create a very intense atmosphere, they do have a big drawback in terms of the pacing of the book. Now, in The Witching Hour, the first part of the book follows Michael and Rowan and Aaron Leitner, the people I described in the summary, as they're kind of getting into the mysteries around them. Then in the second part of the book, we kind of take a break from all that while Michael is reading the history of the Mayfair Witches. Now, I love the history of the Mayfair Witches, as I've said, but it does stop, put a stunting block on the main plot, because basically we've got a whole part where we're just learning about history. And even if the history does inform the present day, it's still like a big digression. Then we get to the third part, and we get a bit of plot moving around, a bit of relationship developing, and all that kind of thing. But then again, we get this digression to describe the house, which, yes, beautiful, yes, atmospheric, but also another stopper on the plot. And then we get to the fourth part of the book, and the plot just kind of goes, it just ends. The book just ends really suddenly. And to me, that was probably the most disappointing part of the book, was the final part, because of how rushed it was. Without going into spoilers, the main issue I had then was that, and I have had this problem with other Rice books as well, she'll spend a lot of time building atmosphere, building tension, building a setting, and eventually we come to, page 900, and she's like, well, I've got quite a lot of words here, I need to finish the story now. And so you just kind of get this snap ending out of nowhere, and it's a bit of a shame. It would be better if she spent more time on the plot, building it and developing it through the digressions, so that it just didn't feel so sudden and abrupt when we get to the end. A related point that negative reviews often pick up on with the ending of the book especially are some of the character decisions that are made, and they just seem very out of character. Now, I actually think that the decisions that the characters make at the end are actually foreshadowed quite well early on in the book. Rice does spend time with developing her characters and, showing you things about their psychologies. And these things do foreshadow what happens at the end of the book. But the problem that I think I have with this, and I think it's the problem that people pick up on here, is that while you might have foreshadowing, you don't really have any events in the story that trigger the shift in behaviour. So it just comes across as unmotivated, even if it's foreshadowed by stuff that's gone on before. So that for me was probably one of the weaker parts of the book. I think it does have some pacing problems, and that does kind of make the plot a little bit thin. Part 5. Romance and character development. I think Rice is really good at creating characters, especially in a kind of historical sense. When you look at the history of the Mayfair Witches, as I've said, all the generations of characters feel incredibly vibrant, and each individual character is really colourful. They have unique interactions and relationships with others, and I think Rice is really good at this kind of creating a character or describing how her characters are. But I do think one of the problems that Rice has with her characters is developing her characters in a realistic way. And this comes across especially in the present-day storyline with Rowan and Michael. Now, these two have very little time together before they suddenly fall head over heels in love with each other. And this to me just came across as really unrealistic. In fact, I thought that there was possibly something supernatural drawing the two of them together, and so it sort of made sense that they would have this kind of crazy attraction for each other. But at least in terms of this book, it doesn't seem like that was the case. And given that their romance is meant to be one of the big parts of the book, it was not a very realistically drawn romance. It kind of made sense that they would be attracted to each other, given what we know about their backgrounds and what they like to do in bed, but it didn't make sense that they would, want to get married after knowing each other for like a week or however long it is before they decide to do that. That being said, I didn't think that Rowan and Michael were bad characters. It's just that I didn't feel like they developed in an organic way, and part of that was because the key moments of their character development are in the fourth part of the book, where their motivations change, and it just happens so quickly that we don't have time to, follow them with that development. I think, like with the Vampire Chronicles, or at least some of the books in the Vampire Chronicles, this first book, at least in the Mayfair Witch Trilogy, is much more focused around world building. The series is called The Lives of the Mayfair Witches, and I think that's at least what this first book is doing for the most part. There is this framing plot that is important, but Rice really, in this book, she really wants to kind of tell a history, and so that is the thing that's taking precedent over character development. And so, for me, I can kind of forgive that because I really enjoyed the history of the Mayfair Witches. I do think the characters themselves are well drawn, and I'm willing to kind of overlook some of the deficiencies in the plot, or lack of plot. But yeah, I think if you prefer a plot-based book, if you prefer the faster-paced Vampire Chronicles books like Tale of the Body Thief, and if you don't really like the slower-paced books like The Vampire Armand or Memnoch, then you might struggle with this book because it is huge. It is, I think, either bang on 1,000 pages or just over or just under it, but it's around that big, so it's a very long book with lots of digressions. But for me, I enjoyed that. I thought that Rice's world building in this book and the family tree of the Mayfairs was so complex, so interesting, that I was just captivated by that and that story. And so, even despite these deficiencies with the plot and some of the character development, it it's still a fantastic book, and definitely up there for me in terms of favourite Anne Rice books that I've read so far. Part 6, Conclusion. So to sum up, I do think this is definitely worth reading, especially if you only know Rice's Vampire Chronicles. The Mayfair Witches books, well, this one anyway, so far is fantastic, and is certainly up there with some of the best of the Vampire Chronicles series. The world she creates around the Mayfair Witches is just as complex and nuanced as the world she creates with her vampires. Rice's skill at building interesting mythologies is definitely the most interesting part of her work. Also, again, she manages to take you through various periods of history and really capture the feel of all of these various places throughout time, and I do think her prose is just gorgeous in this book. That being said, the prose is very bloated and the story is very long, so if you struggle with that side of Rice's work, then the Mayfair Witches might be a bit of a slog, but if you're willing to give it a go, I think you will enjoy it, because I think the mythology and the world building and the Mayfair family tree is just so interesting that hopefully that will allow you to overlook the bloatation in the prose and some of the issues around the plot. That's it for this video though. I'm looking forward to reading the next 2 books in the series, because it seems like those 2 books tend to have a lot more of a Marmite feel to them. A lot of people seem to really enjoy the first one, and then apparently the other 2 books go into some weird directions. But I personally am looking forward to seeing what those directions are, even if I don't end up liking them. But that is it for this video. If you have read this book, please let me know in the comments what you think. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Also, without spoilers, tell me what you think of the other 2 books in the series if you've read them, just so I can get a sense for what might or might not be coming up in the next 2 books. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos weekly on Mondays, so if you want to be notified for that, then subscribe to the channel. But that's it for this video though, so take care everyone. I'll see you all next time.